Hi, good morning. My name's Howard Baxter, and I'm the head of KYC Managed Services at ComplyPort. Today, we really wanted to talk to you and I suppose give you some examples, and I think that's often the best way around outsourcing and managed services and how this can benefit firms. We often chat to firms who are quite small in nature, and they often don't see the benefits of that. And so we wanted to walk through some examples of what we've done with clients that will better illustrate the services that can be offered in this space and how that benefits firms, both smaller, medium-sized firms and large firms in remediations. And so what I'll do today is just walk you through some of those case studies. I think it's quite easy to empathize with the case study. You probably have shared experiences and they're very similar. So towards the back end of the presentation, I'll start taking you through some of those examples. Um, so I think we've broken this up today. Well, I've broken this up today into three pieces. So the challenges of running in-house teams, in-house compliance teams, specifically focused around sort of those operational aspects, the potential benefits of outsourcing. A lot of those are focused on the larger firms, but we do sort of speak about the smaller firms, and then we give you those examples of some of the work we do with clients at the moment, and the benefits that they've seen in using these services. Um, so to start off with, I'll just walk you through some of the what we see as the challenges of running those in-house compliance teams. Um, and naturally, these are often seen as a cost center, and some of the big issues are around that cost of staffing. So building, maintaining qualified compliance teams can be expensive, and especially for smaller organizations. There's also, with those smaller organizations, the inability to attract talent. Often that compliance officer is playing multiple roles and is then having to do onboarding. If the organization's large enough and you can have an ops team, it's then often quite difficult to show career progression within that team. So people become despondent, they leave, and that just creates churn. And we see that quite a bit, where that churn then leads to, new training, etc. So it's often that those hidden costs that you don't see that lie under the water, that start adding into that cost of compliance in this space. Complexity of regulations. So we know the regulatory landscape is constantly changing, and it requires continuous education. So often, outsourced providers provide strong sort of training platforms for their staff, as well as speaking to that first point or earlier point around career progression. So from being an analyst into a quality control into team lead and then to consulting. So you often see that, and they can see that career progression. Hence, they tend to stay involved for longer, less churn, less training. I think it's also one of the things we do speak to about clients on, and I'll go into now. In remediation projects that we do see, um, often what we would suggest to clients is push the training risk onto your provider. Um, Often clients want to do that in-house, and train staff. We know there's going to be churn on those projects in terms of remediation, in terms of staff coming and going. And so then clients are then typically using their QCs, etc., to retrain those new staff, rather push that onto the clients, and make it their responsibility to do that, so that then they are then going to have to train staff pre them becoming engaged on a project. So different ways to look at that, and I'll speak about that again later. Um, some varied requirements. We know there's often conflicting regulations between what different countries need. That's often better understood by people who come from a strong compliance background. And then, as mentioned, the training needs, which can be time consuming and extremely costly, especially on smaller engagements where you start to see churn really impacting the ability to deal with remediation, or just, creating a real drain on senior resources constantly having to step into QC records and to get people up to speed. In large organizations, you often see outdated technology. I think in smaller organizations, and we'll show this in some of our case studies later, often there is no technology. It's often Excel based. They don't have a KYC tool, which is understandable. They're just too small to have that, and it's not a cost benefit, and we don't suggest that they necessarily go down those roads. Um, and even a screening tool is potentially expensive for them with the fixed fees, etc. You can also see this in the crypto space where, chain analysis, minimum contracts, 200,000. Those things start to have an impact on a smaller firm. So the ability to spread that cost and wear that as a singular outfit is a massive benefit for small organizations who then don't have to go in paper with a screening provider or a KYC tool. So what we do see is on the larger firms, often outdated technology. We know it's moved massively over the last few years. So it's now about replacing that and the work that goes with that. And you often have quite resource intensive processes. So, um, especially in the smaller firms where they don't have technology, um, you tend to see a lot of Excel, a lot of paper moving around, which is understandable, but there are likely to be errors. And so, how can you help to remove that? We often see in compliance teams a lot of competing priorities. So there's always that pressure and the balance that you need to strike, business objectives of onboarding clients quickly, being that yes rather than a no. And that often leads into conflicts and compromises that need to be made. And those are difficult to align. And then what we do see is a sort of a lack of organizational support. Compliance is a hindrance, and it's not there to achieve business goals. And then with some of our smaller clients who are starting to grow rapidly, you start to see that the cost of compliance just grows as the organization grows, and you don't create that jaws that you would want to start seeing in terms of cost to onboard per client. And you'd want to see that come down over time. And that tends not to happen because you started off quite small, quite paper-based, and that doesn't change. And as you start to hit scale, you now need to start changing. So what are some of the benefits of outsourcing? We'll do these and then we'll go through some of those case studies that I've mentioned. So naturally, cost savings is one of the biggest, and I think we focus primarily on that within our examples on the next slides. So reduced overhead expenses, you don't need infrastructure, systems, equipment, and in-house sort of expenses. And there's different ways to look at that, and we'll explain those in some of our case studies. You can convert what is a fixed cost into quite a variable cost structure. We do like to sort of move to a cost per record where possible with our clients, where it's quite a vanilla type of transaction that we can see with vanilla onboarding. So when you can get into that space, then cost per record becomes feasible and very attractive for our clients. Low cost locations naturally have a massive benefit here. Not all clients want to use them. We do have clients who are quite particular in terms of using either our UK hub, some are okay, pushing into Europe. Others are willing to go into even low cost locations like India or Sri Lanka. So really it is about clients' preferences and where they want to see the work being done, and also the budget, because there is naturally a budget consideration here. One of the big benefits that we see is that sort of specialized knowledge. So you really do have access to expertise, um, and not only expertise, but industry best practice. So the ability to share what other clients are doing with a client to say, why aren't you asking for this on your onboarding form? It will reduce the touch points going back and forth to clients. If there is, in terms of often on those corporate records, we see that back and forth. And it is about reducing that and helping the client to understand what can be done to reduce that sort of friction. There's always a sort of a focus on core functions and businesses. So clients, what we find is then they can focus on what matters to them rather than the compliance piece, because once it's been outsourced, you can focus on your core business, and resources can then be allocated towards that revenue sort of generating piece, which naturally is the core component. We also do see time savings as with the other benefit, sort of faster service delivery, 24/7 type models. Um, as we'll show you with some of our smaller clients, we don't necessarily just apply one resource to a project, even though they're using a small allocation of time from us. We will train up two or three people just because if someone's on leave, etc., there's always someone to deal with records. So that ability to then really push records through. And also, we know that, and what we do see with clients is often there'll be no work with smaller clients, there'll be no work for 2 weeks potentially, and then a massive spike in volumes. And having two or three people allocated to that client does mean you can then quickly onboard those clients for them. Um, we do see that again in terms of the scalability and flexibility. So it's far easier to scale up and also to scale down based on those business needs. So, clients coming to us and saying, listen, can you also do this piece of business for the next 6 months? And then you can wind that piece down. If there's remediation or reviews off the back of that, you can quickly scale up a couple of hours or a couple of people, depending on sizing of those projects. Um, and then what we do see is the ability to start using advanced technology. So various solutions built in-house or partner solutions where you have the ability to start tapping into that, which you probably couldn't afford previously or didn't make financial sense. And the ability to now start using that technology because you piggybacking off an outsourced provider. We do see a lot of that benefit, and our clients see a lot of that benefit as well. And that means as those products improve and there is innovation around that, their services improved. All of that we think, and we'll show now in our examples, gives you better sort of performance metrics, time to onboard, cost to onboard, and there is a continuous improvement element that we do see. And as mentioned earlier, that's around the sharing of ideas across clients that we see and across from what we see in the industry. So now we'll just take you through a couple of examples. And the first one we start with is sort of a smaller firm that we deal with. They're a stablecoin firm, and previously they're only onboarding about 5 to 7 clients. That's starting to grow, but now, and previously they were just buying KYC reports, no KYC tools, no screening engine, very paper-based, and so they were just purchasing these reports. The cost of that was extremely expensive. And so as they're starting to take on more clients, this was starting to become an issue for them. They also didn't have ongoing monitoring of those accounts as well. So they would have to keep going back to get screening done as and when they felt necessary. And speed, I think there's also a lack of flexibility with the provider in terms of purchasing these reports and time to turn around. So what was the solution? So we allow them to use a KYC tool that we have in-house, as well as a screening engine that we partner up with, where they could then, in terms of the KYC tool, store all of the client data and documents. They can see how many clients have been onboarded, how long they took to be onboarded. If they wanted to take anybody off, they could do so. As mentioned, screening can then be done and on an ongoing basis, or as often as they wanted. They would then get a completed template per client, which they could take to a risk committee, sign that off. Clients found that quite useful. Sort of gave a full summary on a couple of pages. So it was a very flexible staffing model. What we often find, and even with the smaller, but especially with the medium and larger size firms that we deal with, people tend to fill the time they have to do the task, whereas we honestly believe that this client didn't need anything more than about 28 hours a month, which is spread across, whichever days they need that onboarding. We couldn't see any more hours than that, and that's probably proved correct. So no need for them to go and get a full-time resource. We did build records to the client's policy, but we also did suggest some improvements to that policy, as well as to onboarding forms. We just felt that there was a lot of back and forth, and that could be improved by some minor tweaks to their onboarding form, which helped them and also reduce sort of that friction back and forth as we were asking for documents on their end clients. What we did see is the cost per record for this client decreased from about £2,500 for these the reports that they were purchasing to under 350, and that's probably coming down as they sort of scale up and do more. And as mentioned previously, these clients didn't really have any tools, no ability for ongoing monitoring. So a classic example, I think this is quite indicative of a lot of other firms in a very similar situation. We see a lot of interest around this sort of tool because you don't have to go and purchase a screen tool. You don't need KYC and you don't need full-time resources, and the flexibility here is important. And I think once this gets a little bit larger, their clients are quite complex. I'm not sure if we'll be able to move to a fixed cost per record potentially, but they are very high risk clients they deal with in tricky jurisdictions, tricky languages. So we tend to see that more in the vanilla. But this is a classic example of a smaller firm and the benefits that can be extracted. So it doesn't really matter how small you are, 5 to 7 onboardings a month, a classic case study, and we see this quite often within our business. So then we move on to a slightly larger firm. It's a corporate finance firm, investment manager. They had a person who was doing this role. I think if you go into the market, a junior resource is probably going to cost you around £40,000. And we always say that's sort of, the piece that you see, but after you start including the other costs, such as leave, sick leave, NI, bonuses, etc., you're often well north of 60, probably closer to £70,000. And again, what we do see is that that person tends to fill their time with tasks, whereas if you actually said to them, you're only allowed this amount of time to complete this, they probably would have completed it in that time. So when we went back to the clients, we mentioned to them we didn't think they needed anything more than 56 hours a month, and naturally we endeavor to push their work into that by trying to streamline processes as much as we can. This client had a really strong technology stack already in place, so they didn't want to make use of our technology environments, tools and screening. They wanted to remain on their stack, which as mentioned was well known. It's extremely powerful. So we just Citrix into their environment. Again, we've trained, same as the smaller firm, trained 2 or 3 people on this client's policy. And again, high level of complexity in terms of the targets that they were acquiring and that we needed to onboard. So again, built a client policy, and I think the benefits that we saw here is definitely around, I think that flexibility. Our staff are there 24/7. There's no sick leave. There's no just normal sort of personal leave because we've got 2 or 3 people. So there's always somebody on this project. Again, very similar to the smaller firm in terms of we tend to sometimes see nothing for a week, and then we see quite a quick ramp and usage of hours. And again, this client we can see now starting to grow into other pieces. So we do expect some more hours to come out of this project in terms of there's other pieces that they can see they can now start to push into their current time allocation. So now into a sort of a larger bank type project. So a large transaction monitoring. I think it started as a project, but it's sort of become a managed service. Migrating tools and systems, and so they required a team 24/7, 7 days a week, and the ability to flex up and down. So they were recalibrating this transaction monitoring tool. We've seen this also on screening as well. And so to hire 10 staff in to complete this, when suddenly it would be 5 the one day and the ability for 15 the next. So we had to build a model that would suit that type of flexibility that the staff member required. And so having staff that could come on and come off the project quite quickly was really important, and even on sort of like a day's notice, because they can shift onto other work. So that was really important, that flexibility on this project. Um, and again, I think TM screening, very vanilla. You know, as long as you're dealing on the hit basis rather than an account basis, you can very quickly get to a vanilla type of pricing structure and thus offer a fixed fee per hit to be established. So once you get that turnaround time per hit, you can very quickly get to that per hit per cost type of structure. We then set a floor and a ceiling in terms of minimums and maximums, with tolerances and thresholds around that. Naturally, we didn't want staff not to be able to do anything, but we also didn't want to have this spike dramatically. So we worked with the client to sort of build something that worked for both of us in terms of that flexibility, where they could flex up quite quickly and flex down quite quickly as well. Naturally, this was a low-cost location type project. Price was everything for them. Very vanilla type of work that needed to be done. Very different to sort of that smaller and medium firm that I discussed earlier. Staff were paid on a per hit basis. I think that works well. And you do see a massive change in productivity of those staff. I think the one thing you always need to be careful of in that situation is the quality. And again, you've got to layer in a strong quality element, as well as um, an element of pay that is linked to quality, and probably a larger component, so that you do see speed, but you see speed plus quality. And that becomes really important. So I think that's mentioned there in terms of that pay is coupled with that sort of consequence for fails. In terms of this project, we estimated the savings for them to be about 60%, so roughly about £1 million on an annual basis for this. It will start decreasing as that TM tool is calibrated correctly, and as we basically see on a weekly basis, tool gets calibrated, large number of hits come in, and then it starts tailing off as the tool starts to learn and calibrate correctly. So a larger bank. And then we move on to a remediation type project in terms of outsourcing. So asset management firm, backlog of about 12,000 files that required updating. I think one of the key things that we always mention in this, and I think I've spoken previously on other webinars about remediation projects, and that really is around getting to grips with the data first before you start employing people to build files and contact clients. Make sure that that data set is clean. And so we spend a lot of time on that data set. And that final data set, once cleansed, duplicates removed, no AUM, hierarchies built, and that data set was about reduced to about just under 2,000 names that we needed to contact. And I think that actually sets them up really well for the future. On this, again, the clients, we knew that there'll be some flex in this as clients responded back to the requests that we were making. So really a full-time analyst and then an analyst that could flex into this work as and when inboxes got full, they could then step in. The client didn't want idle time if they had two analysts and we weren't getting responses from clients, and they were paying for idle time. So we prevented that by just creating some of that flexibility in this model. Again, a balance with low cost locations used to provide additional benefits to this client. And we estimate on this engagement probably about a saving of about £65,000 over the course of the engagement because of these various pieces. And I think that 65 ignores the data cleanse. I think, it would have been a lot more if somebody just walked in and started cleaning 12,000 files. That probably would have been, 6 months, maybe 1 year project rather than a 2 month project. So that data cleanse really going to benefit this client moving forward. So I think, to sum up, what we've seen in this sort of industry is that everybody can, I think when people think outsourcing, they tend to think larger firms, they tend to think low cost locations, but we have seen a shift. We do see a lot of clients, especially smaller clients, that don't want to build that infrastructure, don't want to build teams, or don't even require full-time resourcing on this, start to make use of managed services because they get that benefit of a very strong technology stack if they don't already have one, and also flexible resourcing where they're not having to pay a full-time resource. They then see the churn as that person moves on and they've got to retrain and start again. They now have far wider net of resources in terms of 2 or 3 people that they can make use of, flexible time, and you do see some efficiency start to build into that model. And so I think when people think outsourcing, don't always think around those large firms. It really is scalable, and we do see a lot of benefit, especially those small and medium firms that can benefit from a managed service. Um, I think that's it from us today. Thank you for attending. We will be reaching out and also supplying you with some access to Vika, our AI tool, which you'll be able to get access for free. Very beneficial in the compliance space. Only makes use of sort of sources that we have verified rather than just somebody who's written a document in the basement and it's on Google. So a really powerful tool which you can then access. I'd like to thank you for your time today, and please, if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.